not a very good shot, but the Samaritan here uses really big bullets.
The version of the Samaritan Pistol that I'm going to be talking about is based on the version that's been used in the Guillermo del Toro films, with Ron Perlman playing the Hellboy character. As I've done in the past, I've taken a bit of inspiration from both films to come up with a prop that I'm happy with. And whilst the Samaritan Pistol that's featured in the first and second film are essentially portrayed as being the same piece, there are some minor differences from the first to the second film. I started working on the ammo box first for the pistol because I thought it would make a really good addition to the way it would be displayed, but there was very little information about the box that was used. The box I'm going to be working on only appears on film for a few seconds. So this is pretty much the method that I've come up with to work out the dimensions of the box so that I can start on the project. Because there's not a lot to work with as far as screen grabs are concerned, I slowed down the footage so that I could go screen by screen more easily. The other difficulty with this was that the filming was quite dark, so once I had a good image to work with, I went into Photoshop and started bumping up the brightness and contrast so that I could better pick out the details. Because the image is fairly tightly shot, I decided to pull back on the image and start to manually draw in the missing elements. This gives me a pretty good idea of what the outside of the box should look like, but it doesn't do anything to really tell me what the true size of it is. And what I really need to find is those XYZ dimensions. So there's a little bit of math in this, so bear with me. There's plenty of information available on the Samaritan gun itself, so based on the known factors of those measurements, because I've got the one-to-one reference as well as the photo reference, I can find the ratio between the two, and then using that ratio I can go back to the photo and measure the side of the box. Using that same principle, I was able to measure a known element of the gun lengthwise in both the photo and the one-to-one measurements. Now that I've got an accurate measurement for the width and length of the box, so I was able to find a little bit more footage where the side of the box was shown for a few seconds. And now that I have the width calculation, I can use that same principle by using the photo to calculate the depth dimension of the box, which gives me all three dimensions I need to come up with a plan to have the correct size. Now that I've got the reference material and the dimensions and stuff I need for the project, I can start working on building and hopefully get a pretty good representation of what they showed in the film. I was able to find a brass hinge, which is pretty close to the one that they've used. I was able to get an ammo box that's got the front latch, which is the type of thing I need to mount on the front of it. The handles I'll have to custom make, but they're relatively straightforward, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. And the other off-the-shelf item that I found is a metal toolbox, which is a little lightweight, but it should be fairly easy to modify that as well. Just starting by breaking down and cutting up the toolbox so that it matches the dimensions that we need. Removing all the elements of the toolbox that I don't want, and then cutting it down to match the size that it should be based on the dimensions that I found. I'm going to reinforce the inside of the box with a 4mm marine ply. Just using liquid nails to glue it into place. Once I've lined the inside of the box and the glue set, I can start working out the folding of the metal and rejoining it back into the size that it should be. So now that I've got the undercoat done, for the most part my biggest problem is going to be that the surface is too clean. So I'm going to have to go back and look at some of the reference pictures to see where some of that weathering is. One of the things that can be a little bit tricky is getting all the little weathering bits right, all the little nuanced details of bumps and scratches and these little subtleties of paint and the correct type of font and all that sort of stuff I think actually make a big difference when it comes to the look of it. The first thing I did was I went in and photoshopped this picture similarly to what I did when I came up with the original plans for creating the box in the first place to get the dimensions. The difference is because I now know what the top dimensions of the box should be, I was able to skew and warp the image around to make sure that it fits in the correct orientation, and then with a little bit more warping and adjustment I was able to get the text into the correct position. And because the rest of the image is dragged along with that adjustment, it should pretty much make sure that everything's in its proper place. Now that I've got the basic map laid out for roughly where the scratches and dents and knocks and bumps and that sort of stuff are going to be, and the blemishes that are appearing in the paint, I'm going to do some pre-weathering in terms of the knock around before I continue with the painting. So again, based on pictures, it's almost impossible to work out what's going on as far as the sides and back of the box are concerned. So this next bit's going to be highly technical. I think that'll do. complexity in the cast is really nice in that it's got all the parts broken down into its individual component pieces, and those broken down elements tend to make for a really nice assembly when it comes to building these sort of kits. What I'm doing though is going to be turning this into a cast aluminium version, and as a result of that there's a lot of complexity in the shapes that are going to provide a fairly high degree of difficulty in terms of getting them cast into solid aluminium pieces that will still fit together in an appropriate way and have the mechanisms operate properly. What I've got to do with this is break it down even further. I've started doing some simple stuff first. I'm hoping that I'll be able to cast the barrel section in one piece, and as a result I've blocked off and rounded off those front edges, and that should assist in the separating of the mould, as opposed to this sort of thing where you've got lots of little areas that undercut. So to get the sand packed in there and then be able to get it out in one piece is quite difficult. So to get around those sort of issues, as I said, I'm starting to break these down further, and in this instance what I've done is sliced it down the centre so that I can separate those two pieces into two separate halves. That allows me to pack them into the sand in such a way that I can pack that down on a flat surface and get the sand packed around it as it needs to be, and then when it's taken over it gives me that flat surface that I can then reintroduce the other piece to, and then pack the sand again to that, which allows me to pick up those undercut areas that would be normally lost in this type of method of casting. The revolver chamber, on the other hand, there's a whole lot of complexity in that I've got to try and capture in the sand casting. I might be able to do it as one piece and bore the holes out separately at the end. I'm starting up the casting, and the first part I'm going to have a go at casting is the second most complicated part, which is the barrel arrangement. Because this is still relatively complicated in its shape, I'm going to use a press mould box, which is a little different to the way that I normally prepare these moulds, so I'll just show you how that works. The big difference with this method, first layer is going to be fairly heavily packed, and then as I get progressively higher to the top of the box, it becomes a softer and softer pack so that it's got compression room for when the two boxes are put together and pressed, it can press around the pattern piece and hopefully produce the part that we're after. You have a few limitations with doing this type of thing, and that's generally how thick the piece is. If you get too much thicker than what that is there's not enough room for the sand to compress, and the molten metal will just bleed out the sides and it won't work. Normally this would be done with an industrial press, but given that I don't have an industrial press, this is really my only option. Got a pretty good seal around the outside edge, so hopefully if I haven't disrupted the sand too greatly I should end up with a viable mould. With the pattern piece now removed and a successful mould made, I can now pour in the molten metal. It's picked up the detail quite nicely, and the square edges haven't left me much of an issue as far as the undercuts are concerned. Whilst I was pouring this one out, I had a go at casting up some of the smaller components as well. I've got the hammer mechanism for the gun there, but unfortunately the alignment isn't quite right with that one. It's only a small piece, so I'll melt it down, but the other couple of pieces I've made up, which is the trigger and the release mechanism to open up the revolver chamber. Again, they'll need a little bit of clean up, but they're going to polish up fine. I'm just about to start casting up the part that the pistol grip mounts to, and before I get too carried away with that, I thought I'd actually carve out the handle. The piece of timber that I'm using is some western red cedar. It's quite an old piece that was reclaimed from the building site. The building itself is about 120 years old, so it's a really nice old seasoned piece of timber, and the off-cut piece I've got here is just big enough to accommodate the size of the handle. I'm just going backwards and forwards using the resin handle as reference. Once I've got the shape roughed out on the bandsaw, I just went over to my disc sander and started sanding it down closer and closer to the shape that we're after. And after a little bit more filing, it's getting close to the shape that I'm going for. I only want to go to about 95% of the finished shape, because once I've mounted it on the aluminium piece, I want to be able to clean it up in such a way that it perfectly blends in with the part. Just melting down some metal and getting it ready for the pour. I'm doing a number of different parts here all at once, and because these bits don't need a hell of a lot of metal, it's a lot easier to make all the moulds up at once and get multiple parts poured out. Now that the parts have cooled down, I can start trimming off the excess. There's still a lot to do in terms of cleanup on these parts obviously, but still I'm relatively happy with the way they've come out. I'm really quite happy with the revolver chamber. There's still 4 main sections in it that I'll have to drill out to make room for the bullets, but the open section on the top parts have worked quite well, and I'm fairly confident I'll be able to clean that up without too much trouble. I was able to make up a couple of insert pieces that I'm going to use on the handle. In a couple of different versions I think that's just painted on, but I like the idea of doing a coin type insert that I can use in the timber. So that's the chambers for the bullets drilled out now. I drifted a little bit off centre on a couple of these, but they're still perfectly straight on the top side, so I'm not too worried about it. That's never really going to be seen anyway because it'll be on the inside section where the barrel is. That top alignment is still pretty good, so I'm relatively happy with that, given that all I've got to work with is just a spade drill. So taking my time and keeping the drill cool with a bit of wax seems to have done the job fairly well. If you've seen any of my work, you'll know that I'm a big fan of practical effects in films. Rick Baker did most of the makeup and creature effects for the film. And there were additional creature effects done by Cinevision and Spectral Motion. So as usual, I've started on the more complicated elements first. I'm pretty happy with the way the cylinder chamber's worked out. It's still a little bit sticky, but allowing for final cleanup, that's going to work okay. I've got fairly limited equipment, so I don't think I'm going to drill too much more down into the barrel than what I've already got there. There's no particular need for it to be hollowed out all the way through, and I think once that's sort of painted and blackened in there, you'll never even know that it's not a continuous hole anyway. One of the other things I'm trying to work out is a working trigger arrangement. If you look at how the gun's put together, it's a ridiculously large gun. To try and get my finger over that trigger, it's quite a stretch to get to it, whereas normally a gun trigger is right in close to the handle. And as a result of that exaggerated design, you can see there in that cross section that there's very little in the way of space that can be taken up for a working mechanism. I've made up a little board there to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of layout, and you can sort of see where it would go. And all the research I've been able to find on this particular prop so far has had a working trigger and a working hammer in that they're independently spring-loaded. They don't operate insofar as to say that when you pull the trigger, the hammer drops. I made up this rig to come up with a couple of test ideas in terms of how I might be able to make it work. So after scratching my head for quite a bit and getting very close to abandoning this idea altogether, it was my wife that came up with the solution for it. And the solution basically is this, that because we don't have much depth to work with as far as a mechanism to go inside there, we do have a fair bit of width across this way. So rather than having a slide mechanism, I'm having a tilt mechanism that goes across the length of it. Now I still have to excavate quite a bit of material out of here, but presuming I'm going to be able to do that, we will have a working trigger mechanism. Now this is very rough, but it'll illustrate essentially how it works. You can see here with the arrows and stuff that have been writing on this piece of wood that I've been trying to work out the directionality of it. And the biggest thing is because of the distance between these 2 points, I haven't been able to work out a control rod that would pull from this trigger to act as a release mechanism from the hammer. So rather than the pull mechanism, we've worked out a tilt mechanism. Now the idea behind that is that you can see here that the trigger is beveled, and as that bevel reaches its high spot across that piece, it lifts, similar to how a mousetrap would work. Now we need to work out a return mechanism for that to come back down, but when the hammer comes back again, that would come back into its normal position like that. That's the idea. And as the trigger pulls, it lifts that and the hammer falls. So what we need is a return spring for the trigger and a pull spring for the lever point. And you can see I've got a temporary spring set up for the hammer, and this will all be enclosed within that housing area there as well. So there's a bit to drill out, but the principle I think is there now. What I've got to do now is drill out the necessary channels and see if I can make it work. This is the little hook latch system that works as the release mechanism for the hammer. What you can see there is I've got the hole drilled out, and that's going to house the internal spring that will actually go through that hole and sit in there. And I've pinched that spring out of a mouse trap, because whilst the wire has enough tensile strength to remain a good spring, it's also still soft enough that I can manipulate it into the shape that I need to fit in that piece. So I've set that up there with a countersunk line and a little hole to hold the arm of the spring, and that sits in there flush, and the other piece there sits inside the housing and provides the spring tension we need to make the hammer work. Before I go ahead and put the cover plate on there and strip this down for a final cleanup, I thought I'd show you the final setup for the trigger and how it works. Unfortunately, it doesn't turn the revolver section of it, but I'm willing to concede that given the success I've had with the trigger setup. It operates as a single stage trigger system, so that when I pull that back there, it locks into place, and when I pull the trigger, the hammer falls. It's ended up being a fairly simple sort of setup, although it has taken me a bit of time to get everything sort of positioned just right so that it's a repeatable sort of action all the time. But now that I've got it in place, I'm pretty happy that it's going to last as a working mechanism. You can see the rod that runs down there has a hook on the end. That hook corresponds to the hook that's on the hammer. You can see that the spring-loaded action of it just latches it across. It's only latched on there fairly lightly, but it is still relatively solid. Then the trigger has just a small beveled area, which is just enough to push that rod aside, and as it pushes it aside, it releases the mechanism. And once that final plate's on there, it's going to be completely hidden, running fairly well. I'm going to be putting a blackened oxide layer across the surface of the aluminium on the Hellboy pistol, and to achieve that effect I've bought myself some aluminium blackening agent. The problem with this though is that it's more designed for touch-ups and scratches rather than coating the entire surface. So before I can use this to get the final finish that I want, I need to sort of get 90% of the way there. What I'm going to be using to do that is, this is not labelled, but it's ferric chloride. You can get this from most electronic shops, and some hardware shops will carry it as well. But the thing being with this is that it won't do the job entirely on its own. What you need to do is heat up the surface of the metal to a point where the ferric chloride evaporates off it really quickly, and that causes the oxidizing reaction that you're after, and that's what darkens the surface of the metal. But to show you how this works, what I thought I'd do is just do a smaller piece there. I've already done the butt plate for the handle, and you can see that that's darkened quite nicely. I need to go over that again with the blackening agent to give it a little bit more depth, and then I'll go over it one last time with a black wood stain. This is essentially an acid, which is the reason why I've got gloves on. The other thing that I'm going to do is when I start doing this, I won't be talking because I'll have to put a respirator on, because as I said, you'd be breathing in vaporized acid, which is never a real good idea. Now that it's done, I'm just washed that off in plain water. It's important to make sure that all the acid is washed off because the reaction will continue. Even though you can't see it, it will eat away and bubble away at the metal, and it'll leave a lot of pitting on the surface if you don't get rid of it. But that's pretty much the first stage of the blackening of it. You can see that as opposed to just the regular plain metal. This one's room temperature reactive, so I don't have to heat it up to get the same sort of effect, and that'll add another depth of blackening to it. Now it's the same story. This still needs to be rinsed off once it's finished, but you can sort of see the half that I've done there as opposed to half that I haven't, so it adds that bit more depth to it. Now to finish that off to a true black, I'm adding a black Japan wood stain. Whilst that's glossy and wet like that, I'll hit it back in the flame and that'll bake it into the surface of the oxidized layer. The other little mechanism that I've worked out is the spring-loaded section that operates the tilt release. I still have to make up the pin that runs through there for the actual release mechanism, but now that I've got the spring in place for that, that should be relatively straightforward to sort out as well. So from here on in, it's all about final finishing details, making sure all the little screws and pieces are set up to replace all the temporary pins that I have in place at the moment, and then it'll be on to the final finish and blackening up all the parts. I'm about to start working on the bullets for the pistol, and I'm going to do them so that the tip of the bullet is made from pewter and the back casing section is made from brass. Now that I've got all the parts cut out and ready, it's really just a matter of working out the finishing details so that I can come up with a completed set. I'm also working on a transparent version that I've carved out for some perspex. I was able to modify a spade drill to get the shape on the inside that I was after, and once I add the little silver tip to it, that will finish it off quite nicely as well. It also doesn't look like there's going to be any issue as far as sealing liquid inside it, so I'll be making up a set of those to go with the pistol as well. So now that I've got all the bits together, and after a little bit of playing around, I've come up with a prototype for what I'm going for. That's the clear one that'll be filled with liquid, and that's the pewter one to give you a bit of an idea as well. I want to refine the crimping a little bit. I've worked out a way of doing it. I just need it to be a little bit neater than the way that's come out. I've also ordered some stamps so that I can get the lettering put on the back, and I want to tidy up what I'm doing as far as the primer is concerned a little bit as well. I do like the idea of the primer being the silver colour. That's generally how they are. On the resin one that I've got, the primer is actually raised, which doesn't seem to be quite right to me. So I'm going to be setting the cap into the brass pretty well flush, which is more like what a real bullet looks like anyway. try and get all the pieces looking exactly the same, I've made up a number of jigs that allow me to maintain the consistency and the shape and size of them. This one I've made up a modified drill piece to go into the block of wood so that I could set the tips of the bullets and file back the bit that goes into the shell so that the tips all maintain exactly the same length. I made up this one to use in conjunction with my renovator tool. I'm using a sharp edge rather than a serrated edge. That's so I can get a nice fine engraved line that acts as the border I'm after. It's just a matter of setting in at that little base, which again keeps it at a consistent depth so that I can then introduce the tool to it, and when that's on it's just a matter of rotating around. And the final thing I came up with was the crimping to get a consistent crimp around the outside edge. And the way I've done that was to take some thread bar and bend that around to make a circle that's a pretty neat fit for the brass tubing. Then I modified a pair of pliers so that it has a round edge on the inside there, and it was just a matter of holding in the correct place like that, using the round edge on the inside of the pipe, and then squashing that down until I got the crimp that I wanted on the outside edge. But I've also decided I want to have a go at making up a speed loader to go with it, or possibly even a couple of them. I've got some pretty good reference material there as far as pictures are concerned, but while I've got the resin bullets to work with, I don't have any of these components at all, so I have to make them all from scratch. The one starting point that I did have to work with is this top section with the writing on it there, and the writing on that pretty well matches the butt plate for the pistol's handle. The one disadvantage with that obviously is that the piece that went on the handle there is flat. But what I've got is a crystal ball sort of thing, which is about the right size I need for the dome shape, and I was able to heat the piece up that it became soft enough that I was able to squash that over the top of the ball and get that dome shape that I needed. Once I had that shape, I backfilled it with a resin putty, and that's given me the starting point that I'm going to work with to see if I can come up with this little device. Been able to make up something that's pretty close to the original, the major difference being the fixed cross piece. In the pictures you can see there it seems to have some sort of hinging arrangement, probably to allow everything to sort of latch into place. Pretty sure in the original version the little square that's there is the bit that rotates, and the shoulder of the square is what sits off the edge and stops the bullet from falling out. But what I found is by rotating that main piece that the shell will drop out of there and give me the same sort of effect without the need to have any release springs on the outside arms. I've been able to cast up that cross piece in one solid piece, which has significantly cut down the number of pieces I needed when it came to the full assembly of it. And it looks pretty close to what we're after, so I'm happy enough for that.